Hi friends, welcome back to Terry Pratchett's The Wee Free Men. As usual, please go wash your hands. Press pause and go wash your hands. I'll wait. Okay, clean hands? Fantastic. Okay, where were we? Oh goodness, I don't actually know where we were. I didn't put a bookmark in, which was a mistake. All right, here we go. We're still in chapter 3. She heard voices. She pushed the door open with her foot to hear them better, because a witch always listens to other people's conversations. The sound was coming from the other side of the hedge, where there was a field that should have been full of nothing but sheep waiting to go to market. Sheep are not known for their conversation. She snuck out carefully into the misty dawn and found a small gap that had been made by rabbits, which just gave her a good enough view. There was a ram grazing near the hedge, and the conversation was coming from it, or rather somewhere in the long grass underneath it. There seemed to be at least 4 speakers, who sounded bad-tempered. "Crivens, we want a cow beastie, not a sheep beastie." "Ah, one's as good as the other. Come on, lads, grab a hold of leg." "Aye, all the cows are in the shed. We take what we can." "Keep it down, will you?" "Ah, who's listening?" "Okay, lads, Jan, Tan, Tetra." The sheep rose a little in the air and bleated in alarm as it started to go across the field backwards. Tiffany thought she saw a hint of red hair in the grass around its legs, but that vanished as the ram was carried away into the mist. She pushed her way through the hedge, ignoring the twigs that scratched at her. Granny Aiken wouldn't have let anyone get away with stealing a sheep, even if they were invisible. But the mist was thick, and now Tiffany heard noises from the henhouse. The disappearing backward sheep could wait. Now the hens needed her. A fox had got in twice in the last 2 weeks, and the hens that hadn't been taken were barely laying. Tiffany ran through the garden, catching her nightdress on pea sticks and gooseberry bushes, and flung open the henhouse door. There were no flying feathers, and nothing like the panic a fox would cause, but the chickens were clucking excitedly, and Prunes, the cockerel, was strutting nervously up and down. One of the hens looked a bit embarrassed. Tiffany lifted it up quickly. There were 2 tiny blue, red-haired men underneath. They were each holding an egg clasped in their arms, and they looked up with very guilty expressions. "Ah, no," said one. "It's the bairn. She's the hag." "You're stealing our eggs," said Tiffany. "How dare you? And I'm not a hag." The little men looked at one another and then at the eggs. "What eggs?" said one. "The eggs you're holding," said Tiffany meaningfully. "What? Oh, these? These are eggs, are they?" said one who had spoken first, looking at the eggs as if he had never seen them before. "There's a thing. And there was us thinking they were, stones." "Stones," said the other one nervously. "We crawled under yon chucky for a wee bitty warmth," said the first one. "And there was all these things. We thought they were stones, which was why the poor fowl was clucking all the time." "Clucking," said the second one, nodding vigorously. "So we took pity on the poor thing and put the eggs back," said Tiffany slowly. The one who hadn't been doing much talking nudged the other one. "Best do as she says," he said. "It's gang ugly. You canna cross an Aiken, and this one's a hag. She'd ding Jenny, and no one have ever done that before." I didn't think of that." Both of the tiny men put the eggs back very carefully. One of them even breathed on the shell of his and made a show of polishing it with the ragged hem of his kilt. "No harm done, mistress," he said. He looked at the other man, and then they vanished. But there was a suspicion of red blur in the air, and some straw by the henhouse door flew up in the air. "And I'm a miss!" shouted Tiffany. She lowered the hen back onto the eggs and went to the door. "And I'm not a hag!" Are you fairies of some sort? And what about our sheep, she added. There was no answer but the clanging of buckets near the house, which meant other people were getting up. She rescued the fairy tales, blew out the candle, and made her way into the house. Her mother was lighting a fire and asked what she was doing up, and she said that she'd heard a commotion in the hen house and had gone out to see if it was the fox again. That wasn't a lie. In fact, it was completely true. Tiffany was, on the whole, a quite truthful person, but it seemed to her that there were times when things didn't divide easily into true and false, but instead could be things that people needed to know at the moment and things they did not need to know at the moment. Besides, she wasn't sure she knew at the moment. There was porridge for breakfast. She ate it hurriedly, meaning to get back out into the paddock to see about that sheep. There might be tracks in the grass or something. She looked up, not knowing why. Ratbag had been asleep in front of the oven. Now he was sitting up, alert. Tiffany felt a prickling on the back of her neck and tried to see what the cat was looking at. On the dresser was a row of blue and white jars that weren't very useful for anything. They'd been left to her mother by an elderly aunt, and she was proud of them because they looked nice but were completely useless. There was little room on the farm for useless things that looked nice, so they were treasured. Ratbag was watching the lid of one of them. It was rising very slowly, and under it was a hint of red hair with two beady, staring eyes. It lowered again when Tiffany gave it a long stare. A moment later she heard a faint rattle, and when she looked up, the pot was wobbling back and forth, and there was a little cloud of dust rising along the top of the dresser. Ratbag was looking around in bewilderment. They certainly were very fast. She ran out into the paddock and looked around. The mist was off the grass now, and the skylarks were rising on the downs. "If that sheep doesn't come back this minute," she shouted at the sky, "there will be a reckoning." The sound bounced off the hills, and then she heard, very faint but close, the sound of small voices. "What did the hag say?" said the first voice. "She said there'd be a reckoning." "Oh, whaley, whaley, whaley. We're in trouble now." Tiffany looked around, face red with anger. "We have a duty," she said to the air and the grass. It was something Granny Aching had said once when Tiffany had been crying about a lamb. She said, "We are as gods to the beast of the field, my Jigget. We order the time of their birth and the time of their death. Between times, we have a duty." "We have a duty," Tiffany repeated more softly. She glared around the field. "I know you can hear me, whoever you are. If that sheep doesn't come back, there will be trouble." The larks sang over the sheepfolds, making the silence deeper. Tiffany had to do chores before she had any more time to herself. That meant feeding the chickens and collecting the eggs, and feeling slightly proud of the fact that there were 2 more than there might otherwise have been. It meant fetching 6 buckets of water from the well and filling the log basket by the stove, but she put those jobs off because she didn't like doing them much. She did quite like churning butter, though. It gave her time to think. "When I'm a witch, with a pointy hat and a broomstick," she thought as she pumped the handle, "I'll wave my hand and the butter will come just like that. And any little red-headed devils who even think about taking our beasts will be—" There was a slopping sound behind her where she'd lined up the 6 buckets to take to the well. One of them was now full of water, which was sloshing backward and forward. She went back to churning as if nothing happened, but stopped after a while and went over to the flour bin. She took a small handful of flour, dusted it over the doorstep, and went back to churning. A few minutes later, there was another watery sound behind her. When she turned around, there was, yes, another full bucket. And in the flour on the stone doorsteps were just 2 lines of footprints, one leading out of the dairy and one coming back. It was all Tiffany could do to lift one of the heavy wooden buckets when it was full. So, she thought, they are immensely strong as well as being incredibly fast. I'm really being very calm about this. She looked up at the big wooden beams that ran across the room, and a little dust fell down, as if something had quickly moved out of the way. "I think I ought to put a stop to this right now," she thought. On the other hand, there's no harm in waiting until all the buckets are filled up. "And then I'll have to fill the log box in the scullery," she said aloud. Well, it was worth a try. She went back to churning and didn't bother to turn her head when she heard 4 more sloshes behind her. Nor did she look around when she heard little whoosh, whoosh, whoosh noises and the clatter of logs in the box. She turned to see only when the noise had stopped. The log box was full up to the ceiling, and the buckets were full. The patch of flour was a mass of footprints. She stopped churning. She had a feeling eyes were watching her. Lots of eyes. Thank you, she said. No, that wasn't right. She sounded nervous. She let go of the butter paddle and stood up, trying to look as fierce as possible. And what about our sheep? She said. I won't believe you're really sorry until I see the sheep come back. There was a bleating from the paddock. She ran out to the bottom of the garden and looked through the hedge. The sheep was coming back. Backward, at high speed. It jerked to a halt a little way from the hedge and dropped down as the little men let it go. One of the red-headed men appeared for a moment on its head. He huffed on a horn and polished it with his kilt and vanished into the blur. Tiffany walked back to the dairy looking thoughtful. When she got back, the butter had been churned. Not just churned, in fact, but patted into a dozen fat golden oblongs on the marble she used when she did it. There was even a sprig of parsley on each one. Are they brownies? She wondered. According to the fairy tales, brownies hung around the house doing chores in exchange for a saucer of milk. But in the picture they'd been cheery little creatures with long pointy hoods. The red-haired men didn't look as if they'd ever drunk milk in their lives, but perhaps it was worth a try. Well, she said aloud, still aware of the hidden watchers, that'll do. Thank you. I'm glad you're sorry for what you did. She took one of the cat's saucers from the pile by the sink, washed it in the sink, filled it with milk from today's churn, then put it down on the floor and stood back. Are you brownies? She said. The air blurred. Milk splashed across the floor where the saucer spun around and around. I'll take that as a no then, said Tiffany. So what are you? There were unlimited supplies of no answer at all. She lay down and looked under the sink, and then peered behind the cheese shelves. She stared up into the dark, spidery shadows of the room. It felt empty. And she thought, I need a whole egg's worth of education in a hurry. Tiffany had walked along the steep track from the farm into the village hundreds of times. It was less fun. That doesn't make sense. It was less than half a mile long, and over the centuries the carts had worn it down so that it was more like a gully in the chalk that ran like a milky stream in wet weather. She was halfway down when the susurrus started. The hedges rustled without a wind. The skylarks stopped singing, and while she hadn't noticed their song, their silence was a shock. Nothing's louder than the end of a song that's always been there. When she looked up at the sky, it was like looking through a diamond. It sparkled, and the air went so cold so quickly that it was like stepping into an icy bath. Then there was snow underfoot, snow on the hedges, and the sound of hooves. They were in the field beside her. A horse was galloping through the snow, behind the hedge that was now suddenly just a wall of white. The hoofbeats stopped. There was a moment of silence, and then a horse landed in the lane, skidding on the snow. It pulled itself upright, and the rider turned to face Tiffany. The rider himself couldn't face Tiffany. He had no face. He had no head to hang it on. She ran. Her boots slipped on the snow as she moved, but suddenly her mind was as cold as the ice. She had 2 legs slipping on ice. A horse had twice as many legs to slip. She'd seen horses try to tackle this hill in icy weather. She had a chance. She heard a breathy, whistling noise behind her and a whinny from the horse. She risked a glance. The horse was coming after her, but slowly, half walking, half sliding. Steam poured off of it. About halfway down the slope, the lane passed under the arch of trees that looked like crashed clouds now under their weight of snow. And beyond them, Tiffany knew the lane flattened out. The headless man would catch her on the flat. She didn't know what would happen after that, but she was sure it would be unpleasantly short. Flakes of snow dropped on her head as she passed under the trees, and she decided to make a run for it. She might reach the village. She was good at running. But if she got there, then what? She'd never reach a door in time, and people would shout and run about. The dark horseman didn't look like someone who'd take much notice of that. No, she had to deal with it. If only she'd brought the frying pan. "Here, wee hag, stand at ye still, right now!" She stared up. A tiny blue man had poked his head up out of the snow on top of the hedge. "There's a headless horseman after me," she shouted. "He'll no make it, hinny. Stand ye still. Look him in the eye." "He hasn't got any eyes." "Crivens, are you a hag or no?" "Look him in the eyes, he hasna got." The blue man disappeared into the snow. Tiffany turned around. The horseman was trotting under the trees now, the horse more certain as the ground leveled. He had a sword in his hand, and he was looking at her, with eyes he didn't have. There was a breathy noise again, not good to hear. The little men are watching me, she thought. I can't run. Granny Aching wouldn't have run from a thing with no head. She folded her arms and glared. The horseman stopped, as if puzzled, and then urged the horse forward. A blue and red shape, larger than the other little men, dropped out of the trees. He landed on the horse's forehead between its eyes and grabbed an ear in each hand. Tiffany heard the man shout, "Here's a face full of dandruff for you buggle, courtesy of Big Yan." And the man hit the horse between his eyes with his head. To her amazement, the horse staggered sideways. "All right," shouted the tiny fighter. "Big toughy, is ye? Once more with feelin'." This time the horse danced uneasily the other way, and then its back legs slid from under it and it collapsed in the snow. The little blue men erupted from the hedge. The horseman, trying to get to his feet, disappeared under a blue and red storm of screaming creatures and vanished. The snow vanished. The horse vanished. The blue men for a moment were in a pile on the hot, dusty road, and one of them said, "Ah, crivens, I kicked myself in my own head." And then they too vanished. But for a moment, Tiffany saw red and blue blurs disappearing into the hedge. Then the skylarks were back. The hedges were green and full of flowers. Not a twig was broken, not a flower disturbed. The sky was blue with no flashes of diamond. Tiffany looked down. On the toes of her boots, snow was melting. She was strangely glad about that. It meant that what had just happened was magical, not madness. Because if she closed her eyes, she could still hear the wheezy breathing of the headless man. What she needed right now was people and ordinary things happening. But more than anything else, she wanted answers. Actually, what she wanted more than anything else was to not hear the wheezy breathing when she shut her eyes. And there I shall stop. And I will see you next time.